Welcome back to Proxam, everybody. And today we're going to be looking at the new secondary objectives in Nephilim, and we're going to be looking at which ones are the best for Craftworld Eldar. Now, I know a lot of you have been saying that a couple of the objectives have been nerfed for us, as well as the loss of To the Last and so forth have made it extremely hard for us to compete on the secondary objective level. However, I do think there are several objectives in the secondary department that are extremely effective for us as a faction, and honestly might even be a little bit improved over the last rendition of the secondary objectives. So let's jump right into it. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be taking a look at all the secondary objectives for Warzone Nephilim. We're not going to be looking at the specific mission primary objectives. I'll probably do that in another video. And we're going to be looking at which ones in particular are the best for Craftworld Eldar, in my opinion, based on what I've played so far, and also just based on the faction as a whole and how it plays. So just a quick overview of secondary objectives in Nephilim. This has changed slightly, not by much, but essentially you can choose up to 3 secondary objectives. They must be from different categories. So that's a little bit different than before, because before you could choose up to 4 secondary objectives. Now you can only choose 3. They must be from different categories, just like last time. But specifically, you can now choose for multiple faction-specific secondary objectives. So for example, you could have the Hidden Path and Wrath of Cain as 2 of your objectives if you wanted to. You're not limited to 1 anymore like before. So this opens up a lot of options for us because we have a couple of Eldar secondaries that are actually quite effective and quite good. Now, looking at the first category of secondary objectives, Purge the Enemy. These are all based around killing enemy units. Assassination is the general pick. It's great against most armies. It's a good all-around pick in general because typically opponents will have at least 3 characters, including their warlord, which will net you an average of 10 points if you're able to kill all of them. Now, if your opponent doesn't have at least 3 characters, though, it's definitely not worth taking it. And the reason I say that is because if your opponent only has 2 characters in his army, for example, that is only 7 points you can score out of this max. So I don't think it's really good unless your opponent is maxed out on characters, this is one that you should probably not take. Now, what I like about the Bring It Down objective is that they actually merged Titan Slayers with Bring It Down. So essentially, this is fantastic if your opponent has a lot of vehicles and monsters, but you always want to do some mental math before you pick up the secondary objective, and here's why. If your opponent has a lot of vehicles, but they are bad vehicles, like rhinos or something like that, if you see your opponent has something like 5 rhinos, well, you're only going to score a maximum of 10 victory points, right? So there's a catch to this objective in that if your opponent doesn't have enough vehicles for you to actually max out the objective, then it's probably not worth taking unless it's close to maxed and the vehicles are fairly easy to kill. For example, if your opponent is running something like an Imperial Guard, company with a lot of heavy weapons, like basilisks and stuff like that, you might want to consider whether or not your army is actually able to deal with those units. And to be honest with you, your army should be able to deal with it. But if you find yourself in a position where you're a little bit low on anti-tank and you feel like your opponent brought heavy tanks with them, then this objective probably isn't good for your army. So 2 things with this. Make sure your army can handle that many tanks. 2, make sure that you count up the victory points that you can potentially get so that you can actually score a lot of points on this if you end up destroying those vehicles. Let me give you an example. I have an opponent that consistently brings about 5 to 6 vehicles, right? And they're pretty easy to kill. So what I do is I would take the secondary objective against them because I would typically score almost close to the max number of points every game. Because the vehicles that he chose to bring along with him were transports, and transports that had a very easy to kill disposition. There were rhinos and stuff like that, right? So I made sure to bring this. Now, I've gone against other opponents before where I wasn't confident that my tank hunting abilities could deal with all their tanks. In fact, I wasn't confident that I could get the max amount of points during the course of the game, because his tanks were either, again, very tough or able to hide a lot. Of course, this objective wouldn't have been good because I would have maxed out the points at 7 or 8 and his tank still would have been alive, right? Now, the good news is that you score 3 victory points for each destroyed tank between 15 and 19 models. So that includes things like Land Raiders and Monoliths. But again, you have to be careful because if your opponent is running something like 2 or 3 Land Raiders in his list, which I have seen bonkers Space Marine lists with 3 Land Raiders in them. Not the most competitive choice, but I've seen it. You probably won't want to bring this because A, it's hard to bring down Land Raiders, especially if there's 3 of them. B, that's not that many points. That's still a maximum of 9 points on this objective, and that's just not really good enough. The next category is No Mercy, No Respite. So No Mercy, No Respite, grind them down just basically is you score 3 victory points at the end of the battle round if more enemy units than friendly units were destroyed this battle round. So this is great against armies that are larger than your own or about the same size because of the way Eldar play. We hit very hard and we're not easily hit back because of our general play style of hit and run. And you can typically get your points back if you're going against a larger army than yourself, like Imperial Guard, or if you're going in versus an army like Space Marines, which is a little bit less elite, but has more models in it. You can definitely do that with multiple small unit armies. However, word of warning, if you do select this objective against an army that is smaller than your own, you will probably, and honestly, without a doubt, lose a lot of points on this objective. For example, I have an opponent who takes Grey Knights, he takes 3 Dread Knights in his army, and he takes a bunch of small strike squads. But his army only models like 30-something models, right? And to be honest, when somebody's army is that elite, you may kill more units than they kill of yours a couple times. But chances are they're either going to tie with you, right? Because you do have to kill more units, you can't tie, or they're just going to beat you in units killed. Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to actually win because their units are a lot more expensive than yours. But it does mean that you could be in a tricky spot when scoring on this objective. So be careful and be aware of what your enemy's taking. And then we have the opposite secondary, which is really only useful against Horde-style armies, and this is called No Prisoners. Basically, you count up your kills, you divide it by 10, you exclude vehicles and monsters as well as characters, and then, basically, if you score between 50 and 99, you score 1 additional victory point. And if you score over 100 models killed, you score 2 additional victory points. So this is a slightly improved version of the secondary objective that we had before. But it's still pretty bad against most armies. And to be honest with you, again, if you count it up, if your opponent has less than 50 models, let's say your opponent has 30 or 40 models in your army, you're going to only max out at like 3 or 4 points, depending on what they take. And because vehicles and monsters and characters are excluded, if your opponent has 40 models, you're only going to get 3 points out of this objective. So still not one you're going to pick always, but one that can pretty reliably net you about 12 points when fighting Imperial Guard infantry spam or something like that. And again, just do a quick head count. If you see that your opponent has well over 100 models, if your opponent is running 140, 150 models, this is a great secondary objective to pick. But if your opponent's running a very low model count army or a very elite army, then this is just not going to be effective. Especially if somebody's running something like Imperial Knights or something like that, you just don't want to pick this secondary objective. And I know that looking at it at first, it seems easy, right? Oh, I just kill enemy models. That's very easy. I'll pick up that objective. It can be easy, but again, you won't score that many points on it unless your opponent is running a horde-style army. So you have to be cognizant of that before choosing this objective. Now, the next one's an Eldar-specific one. It's Wrath of Cain. So Wrath of Cain, I think, is one that I struggled with for a long time, considering it actually good. Now, a lot of you guys are going to disagree with me and say, well, Wrath of Cain is one of the most meta secondaries to pick for Eldar. And that's true. That's what I've kind of learned, that everybody loves Wrath of Cain because it can score potentially a lot of points and max you out pretty quickly. But here's the thing. Even though it's very effective with builds that fully center around aspect warriors, for example, Baroth is a good one for this one because he can kill at ranged and he can kill in melee and jump back and be safe. So he can theoretically score every turn and max out your points very quickly. Even though it's very effective with builds that center around aspect warriors, it's absolutely useless with builds that focus on other types of units like jet bikes, warwalkers, guardians, support weapons, anything besides aspect warriors. This objective will do very poorly in, and that's because it only affects aspect warriors. The attacks, both ranged and melee, have to be done by aspect warriors. And here's the other thing about this objective that I find a little bit odd. The fact that you need both melee and ranged components to your aspect warriors to be effective. And you need to do this in perfect synchronization. Now, sometimes in the first couple of turns, this is very easy to do because you can very easily kill something at range with an aspect warrior like a Dire Avenger unit and then follow up with a unit of Howling Banshees or Striking Scorpions and kill a unit in melee. The first few turns are not a problem. What is a problem is later in the game once those melee units have been dealt with by your opponent and you have no melee component left. So at the max at that point, you can really only ever score 8 points on this. Now, Baroth changes things a little bit because he's very sneaky and he can sneak in and out of combat and stuff like that, and he can actually score on both in the same turn, believe it or not. But again, if you don't have Baroth and you don't have a heavy component of aspect warriors, or if you don't have multiple combat aspect warrior units, this is going to be very hard to get use out of. And I'm just telling you guys right now, if you look at your build and you only see one unit of melee aspect warriors, honestly, you're not going to be able to score that much on this objective. I can tell you from experience, I've had one unit of melee aspect warriors. I actually chose this secondary very early on last edition. I had a pretty heavily invested aspect warrior army, but I only had 2 combat units. I had a unit of Howling Banshees and a unit of Striking Scorpions. Shining Spears. And during the first few turns, I was able to net 8 points with this secondary. However, after that, I found it much harder to actually score points. And in fact, I was only able to net, I think, 3 more points off of it. Now, that is 11 points, granted. But again, you're not going to be able to score the full amount every time. And after you lose your melee components, you can only maximum at this score 1 point per turn. So it's something that you do have to consider. You have to consider, A, do I have enough melee components in my army to actually make up the points in this? And B, do I have enough aspect warrior units to be able to lock down these bullet points? So do I have enough aspect warriors to destroy an enemy unit with a range attack every single turn? Do I have enough melee components to score on the second bullet point at least twice or 3 times? And can I continuously do these things in a synchronized fashion? Because you won't always be able to do it, and there won't always be a smart time to charge your Howling Banshees into something or to charge your Shining Spears into something, right? Just to get this secondary. You want to make sure you pick good targets. That's the other problem, is that if you run your if you run your Howling Banshees into a chaff unit or a unit that they can't recoup their value from just to get the points on the secondary, and then they die, the Howling Banshees aren't getting their value. And same goes for Shining Spears or any other melee combat unit like Striking Scorpions or whatever, right? they're not getting their value. So even though you're scoring on that secondary in the first couple turns, the unit itself isn't going to be as useful if you don't have good targets. So again, just a word of warning on that. If you do have a very aspect-heavy army, Wrath of the Shrines can be very good. If you don't, it can be bad. And if you don't synchronize your combat and your shooting correctly, you can also just not make good use of that secondary. It is a hard secondary to use. Now, the next one is Warpcraft. Obviously, this is meant for armies that don't have psychers, so this is exempt from us. This is not for us at all. However, Warp Ritual is a great one for Eldar because we have a lot of things that can easily, perform psychic actions and get this off. It's not as good as it was before, though, because we had no problem getting it off before, and it was the full 15 points. Now it's only 12 points, but it scales up. So if you perform it twice, you at least get 7 points off of it. If you perform it 3 times, you get the full 12. The good news, though, is that it's still great, especially if you have Warlock Skyrunners in your army, and most of the time, we're not going to have too much issues getting the full 12 points out of it. And I actually think it's a very effective secondary objective. If you want to max out your points in the first couple of turns, within the first 3 turns, this is very doable with this secondary objective. The next one is Psychic Interrogation, and I also think this is a fantastic secondary, because all it requires you to do is have an enemy character within 24, right? If it's in 24 of any characters, which beats the last one by about 6 inches, you roll your psychic action, and here's the catch too. If you beat the enemy's leadership or tie the enemy's leadership, you gain a command point at the end of the phase as well as scoring victory points. So as long as your opponent has a character that you can do this with, you can do this every single turn and still remain safe with Warlock Skyrunners being able to battle focus back afterward. So it's a very easy one to get, and you can typically get this off at least 4 times in a game and get a few command points in as well. Because again, if you beat the enemy's leadership, which should happen at least once, you'll get an extra command point. Now the next one is Scry Futures. This is the Eldar specific. This is fairly difficult to get compared to the previous 2, as you do need to control the objective, and you can only use it once per objective. So if you have several primary objectives on the board, 3 or 4 objectives, and you use this on an objective, you cannot scry futures on that objective for the rest of the game, which means you're only scoring 3 points, and if there's 4 objectives on the field, you're only going to get 12 points max, and that's if you control it, because you do need to control the objective as well. So this is very hard to get off. There's no real benefit as well. You don't get an extra command point, etc. You're not done with it super early. So honestly, I think Scry Futures is a much worse version of the previous 2, in that not only is it less reliable to get because your opponent can also control the objective, and that means that you cannot actually scry the objective because you need to be in control of it. Not only is it harder to get, but you don't gain command points and you can't get it done that quickly. And in some games, it might even be worse because you have less objectives on the field. So Scry Futures is not really one that I would pick up. It's very easy to get at least 2 off of this ability, but anything more than that is going to be a little bit of a challenge. 3, I think, is even pushing it. I think if you got 3 out of this, it could be pushing a little bit. The only benefit I can see to this is that you can possibly, in some games, get all 15 points off of it, but that's only if you're really dominating the enemy army. And chances are that's not going to happen in very many games that are decently close. On to the Battlefield Supremacy. Behind enemy lines is a fantastic way to easily score 15 victory points for Eldar. And since it's at the end of your turn, your opponent can't really prevent it. Because all you need is to have 2 units in the enemy deployment zone for this to score 4 victory points. And if you have 1 in the enemy deployment zone, you score 2 victory points. So this is a great way. On to the Battlefield Supremacy. Behind enemy lines is a fantastic way to easily score 15 victory points for Eldar. And since it's at the end of your turn, your opponent can't really prevent it. Because all you need is to have 2 units in the enemy deployment zone for this to score 4 victory points. And if you have 1 in the enemy deployment zone, you score 2 victory points. So this is a great way to max out your points throughout the game. And any good Craftworld Eldar army will be able to score on this objective if it has any units of speed. So yes, there are some builds out there that are slower Eldar builds that probably won't get into the enemy deployment zone that often. This isn't good for those armies, but most Craftworld Eldar armies are going to make quick use of this ability, and anything can score except for aircraft. So that includes derelict transports that don't have their cargo anymore and that are wounded like wave serpents. Falcons with the Cloud Strike ability with units inside can also very easily score on this. From turn 1, by the way. Jet bikes, because they're very fast. And of course, Vipers, because again, they're expendable, very fast, can get into positions like this very quickly. So behind enemy lines, I think is probably one of the best battlefield supremacy secondaries for the Eldar. Engage on all fronts is basically the same as it was before. Now, I don't like this objective because it kind of encourages you to spread your army out and possibly put your forces in positions that are unfavorable to you. And it's not something you're going to do anyway. You're not going to find yourself at the end of each turn on all 4 table corners. It just doesn't really happen that often. And if it does happen, if it's deliberately happening by you, you're basically going to find your units in a very hard place where they might actually just be sacrificed for almost no reason, right? Now, the other part of this is that even if you score at the end of your turn for this, that unit that is on that 4th table corner is probably going to die. And that's not something we want to do. We don't want to sacrifice units just to score a measly amount of victory points, right? So this can often trap players into placing their units in awkward or unsafe positions, and honestly, it's just objectively worse in every way than behind enemy lines. Now, if any of you have any disagreements with this or have any clever ways of getting this ability off and to actually work this secondary, let me know in the comments. I'd really like to know how this secondary is more useful than behind enemy lines. And again, maybe there is a very reliable way to get this off every turn. I just don't know about it. So, like I said, leave a comment if you have any thoughts on this secondary objective. I personally think this is hard to get off for any army, and I probably wouldn't take it for any faction, to be honest with you, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Maybe it's good for certain factions. I just haven't had success with it with Eldar, and I always find myself, when I try these out to give them a playtest the first time, when I tried this one out in the last tournament pack, I was really disappointed in this one, and this one was one of those ones where I found it extremely hard to get, and I found myself almost having to sacrifice a couple of units at the end of the game just to get victory points out of it, where I could have just had behind enemy lines, or in the last one it was called Line Breaker, and just basically scored the max amount of points very easily. The next one is the Craftworld specific one. It's the Hidden Path. Now, the Hidden Path is a very good way of scoring an easy victory, 15 victory points, if your army has a webway gate. As you only need 1 model now with objective secured to be within range of it to be in control of it, or you need to have more friendly models than enemy models within range. And this works especially well if you have some units in reserve who can come out of it to sweep enemies off. And what this is going to set up is a damned if you do, damned if you don't position for your opponent, where if your opponent tries to take the webway gate from you, he's going to probably get assaulted with some strategic reserve units within the first couple turns of the game. If he doesn't take it from you, you're going to be scoring continuous points on this every single turn. And you score equal to the battle round that it currently is, so you can very easily max this out at 15 points by the end of the game. And I know I've said this a lot, but if you have Barath, You can easily just fly to this objective. He has objective secured. You can easily just do your thing with Baroth, fly around, kill stuff, and then jump back behind a webway gate arch, be out of line of sight for the most part, and simply just stay there, get objective secured, and score on this objective. Very easy to do if you have Baroth, and to be honest, if you have a webway gate, this is an awesome ability. Or sorry, secondary objective, not ability, secondary objective. But if you don't have one, being able to control an objective versus a webway gate is much harder, and honestly, I don't think it's worth it at that point. It's much harder to achieve and probably too risky to take if you're not taking a webway gate. So raise the banners high is the first shadow operations ability, and essentially what this is it's potentially good, but it requires a lot of resources unit-wise to raise the banners in the first place and then prevent them from falling to enemy units. So for example, if there's 4 objectives on the field and there's 2 on your own side, and you capture those and you raise banners on them turn 1, that's great. You're going to get 2 points the next turn. But if your enemy has anything to capture those, and what I mean by that is, if your enemy forces you off that objective in any way throughout the game, that banner is removed and you have to do it again. And again, you have to do it with one of your infantry units. So it can be very hard to do this. You can't do it with jet bikes. You can't do it with vehicles like Vipers and things like this. So it's going to be very difficult, and it is an action, right? So your unit can't really do anything after that unless it's a Dire Avenger unit or something like that. So again, this can score you a lot of points if you plan on raising the banners and then holding those objectives for the rest of the game. Eldar typically aren't that good at sitting there, though, on an objective and holding it all game. They're very squishy. It's hard to do that. Enemy units will take your objectives away. What I like to do is I like to capture an objective, then move on, right? Make use out of the unit. Leave something on it to just hold it. A cheap unit of infantry like Rangers, or maybe a vehicle like a Wave Serpent or something like that to hold it, not to invest too many points into holding that objective, making your units vulnerable so that they'll just end up getting shot at and die. That's not the way you want to play Eldar typically, but if you do have an army that centers around very tough units that are mostly stationary, things like Wraith Blades or, other things like that are very tough, you can make decent use out of this ability. The next one on the list is Retrieve Nephilim data, which honestly, it's not really a bad secondary at all. And it's not too hard to pull off provided you're using units with 5 or more models for this secondary, and if you're using troops for it, because you get +1 to your roll. Rangers are a fantastic unit for this, just like Scout the Enemy. And basically what you do is if at the end of your turn movement phase, you end your movement within one of the table quarters, you can perform this action as long as it's more than 6 inches away from any other table quarter, right? So you roll a d6 for this, and you subtract 1 from the result if that unit has the troops battlefield roll, and if that result is less than or equal to the number of models currently in that unit, then you put a servo skull on that table quarter and you score victory points if you do this twice of 4. You score 8 victory points if you're able to do this 3 times, and you score 12 victory points if you're able to do this 4 times. So you only need 1 infantry or biker unit to do this. However, you do have to roll on it, and it is possible to fail with units that are not in the troop category. So if you have 5 Wind Rider jet bikes, you could technically fail that roll if you roll bad. So if you roll a 6 on a Wind Rider unit, if you have a unit of 5, you're going to fail that roll. Now, you won't fail if you at least have 6 models or if your 5 model unit is of the troops category. But you will fail in all other cases if that unit is at a lower model count or it's not a troop choice. So just be careful with that. I know that it's tempting to use this on a small unit of like 2 or 3 models because maybe, those models get a few of them killed and you want to still utilize the ability. But it can be just harder to do so with units like that. And even if your opponent kills 2 Rangers out of your unit and you use that, you could still possibly fail this action. And you only have 5 chances, essentially, to actually pull this off. So it might be a little bit difficult. You at least need to make sure that you use it 4 times in a game to max out the points on it. Even if you get it out 3 times, though, it's still pretty decent. It'll still score you 8 points. So I think Retrieved Nephilim data is a pretty good secondary, but it can be difficult to get all 12 points from because it requires you to not only be on all 4 table edges, but it requires you to actually perform this action, which possibly could fail based on what you roll. Now, the next one, which is the Eldar specific one, Scout the Enemy, is still a great secondary for armies with multiple ranger units and fairly easy to score on. It's easy to score on, but it's hard to max out. It does compete with Retrieved Nephilim data, I believe, as both can reliably score you about 8 points. Scout the Enemy just has the potential for the full 15 if you can get a unit of rangers or something like that into the enemy deployment zone. You can start scoring 4 points at the end of your turn, which is very effective. And if your opponent lets you, it's kind of easy to get a unit of rangers into an enemy deployment zone on an isolated part of the board that your opponent doesn't have any units on. But this is not going to happen every game, and it's not going to be a reliable 15 points a game, but it could score you quite a bit. And honestly, I've mostly been able to get at least 8 points on this, if not the full 15 in some cases. But I've found that if my opponent is especially, seeing this coming, that, to be honest with you, it's harder to make happen. But if your opponent doesn't see it coming, you can easily sneak a unit of rangers in the enemy deployment zone and get the full 15 points off this ability. I slightly prefer Scout the Enemy over Retrieved Nephilim data because it's more reliable in my opinion. You don't have to roll for it in most cases. And, well, you don't have to roll for it in any case, which you do have to do with Nephilim data. And it also has the potential of maxing out your points, whereas Nephilim data caps out at 12, and it's very hard to get that 12, to be honest with you. It's very hard to be able to complete an action within all 4 table corners with units that will not roll bad. So it's easy to do it with a couple of models of jet bikes to get into the enemy deployment zone in the first place. But what's much harder is being able to actually roll that dice to complete that action. That can be a little bit iffy, and it's not always guaranteed. So that's why in general, I think I prefer Scout the Enemy still. If you do have a lot of rangers, of course, if you don't have rangers though, Scout the Enemy is not going to be a great objective for you. You might as well go for Retrieving Nephilim data. So in conclusion, I think that Warp Ritual, Psychic Interrogation, and Behind Enemy Lines all stand out to me as the best secondaries for Craftworld Eldar because they can be achieved very easily and score you a lot of points. And in Psychic Interrogation's case, even give you a command point. However, among the rest, I think most are situational based on what you bring to the table and what your enemy brings to the table. For example, Wrath of the Shrines being only good with Aspect Warriors, and Bring It Down only being good if your enemy has a lot of vehicles and monsters on the table. These are both situationally fantastic, but not good if you take the wrong things, or if the enemy takes, different units that might not score you the highest on those objectives. Let's just put it that way. And I think some of them are solid picks in general as well, but they may not be the best altogether at maxing out your points. And I think solid picks, Scout the Enemy and Retrieve Nephilim data are both very solid picks. I don't think they're the best objectives for Craftworld Eldar though. Even Scout the Enemy, I think is good, but the fact that we usually only have 3 units of Rangers max in our armies means that we're probably going to be only scoring on average about 8 to 10 points with Scout the Enemy. And honestly, the same thing with Retrieve Nephilim data. Because of the fact that the later in the game you get, the harder it is to be able to score on those things. Now, what I do think, though, is that, again, Scout the Enemy has more potential to max your points. Nephilim data, though, is still good. I'm still a fan of it. I think that in most of my compositions that don't have as many Rangers, I'll definitely take it. But if I have Rangers available, I'll probably go with Scout the Enemy still. But in any case, go ahead and leave your comments on what you guys think are the best objectives for Eldar. Excuse me. And just let me know what you guys think about the secondary objectives in general in Nephilim. I think we lost a couple of good ones, but we gained a lot of good ones as well. And I think, honestly, we still compete with a lot of these. And I'm just thinking of a lot of these in terms of enemy armies. Quite a few of them require enemy units to get into deployment zones to be able to do actions and things like that. And that might actually be harder for a lot of enemy armies to do, especially slower armies. So just keep that in mind as well. And I think, in fact, we do have a lot of powerful options that aren't really available to other factions in the psychic category of secondary objectives. I think both Warp Ritual and Psychic Interrogation are ones that we can very easily get a lot of points from. Psychic Interrogation in particular is very effective. And Behind Enemy Lines is very effective as well and can easily max out your points in a game. All right, everybody, that's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I've been playing the Nephilim objectives long enough to base an opinion around them and what I think is the best for the faction. But if you guys have any other ideas, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear you guys' opinions on the matter. And, maybe there's something I missed. All right, everybody. Peace out. See you guys next time. Have a good one.